Welcome to AI Decoded. Semiconductors, or AI chips, are tiny yet powerful components that act as the backbone of AI systems. As the world embraces artificial intelligence, these semiconductors increasingly define the world we live in, determining the shape of international politics, the structure of the world economy, and even the balance of military power. So, as the global race for AI dominance gathers speed, countries could be forced into making a binary choice. Will their AI technology be delivered by America or by China? Well, the international affairs think tank Chatham House says Microsoft is calling this a zero-sum approach after the company's president, Brad Smith, told a US Senate hearing on AI the number one factor that will define whether the US or China wins this race is whose technology is most broadly adopted in the rest of the world. Meanwhile, remember DeepSeek, the Chinese startup that shocked the global tech sector with its AI model? Well, Bloomberg says DeepSeek is seriously threatening US dominance in the global AI race. The article says the company's sudden emergence illustrates how China's artificial intelligence industry is thriving despite Washington's efforts to slow it down. Such are the concerns the US has taken a tougher stance on Chinese technology advances, warning companies around the world that using artificial intelligence chips made by tech giant Huawei could trigger criminal penalties for violating US export controls. We'll be speaking to the author of the book House of Huawei later in the programme. But will these measures work? Well, The Economist says AI processors from US AI chip giant NVIDIA continue to make their way into the hands of Chinese AI developers. The Economist says a shadowy supply chain has emerged designed to work around sanctions. Some customers lease access to offshore data centers, while others buy chips through murky intermediaries. Well, let's get a bit more explanation then of how high the stakes are in this battle for global dominance over artificial intelligence. Here's Professor Chris Miller, an economic historian who writes and commentates extensively on the subject.
When I started my research in semiconductors, I thought that because chips were everywhere, chips were easy to make, and because nuclear bombs were only controlled by a handful of governments, they were hard to make. But what I realized is actually the exact opposite. If you take nuclear weapons, that technology has barely improved since the 1960s. It's so easy to make nuclear bombs, even the North Koreans can do it. But chips are everywhere because they're cheap and they're tiny. And making things very inexpensive and very small is extraordinarily difficult. Today, there are just 3 companies capable of producing cutting-edge processor chips, the types of chips that go in phones or computers or are used for AI. For many of those devices, they rely on chips that in some cases can only be made by one company in a single factory in Taiwan. The key risk that hangs over not just the chip industry, but really our entire economy is that something goes wrong between China and Taiwan in the Taiwan Straits, such that we lose access to chips made in Taiwan.
Well, with me is our regular AI Decoded presenter, Stephanie Hare. Stephanie, this is all sounding like the script to a thriller, almost. Let's talk a little bit more about how these tiny chips, these semiconductors, are influencing politics, the economy, the military around the world. We're going to pull up a map, and I want you to explain exactly what we're seeing on this map, Stephanie, featuring 3 different colors. Here we go.
Okay, so under the former president of the United States, Joe Biden, we had restrictions really on chips. So they divided the world into 3 parts. What you're seeing in the blue part were tier 1. That was the most permissive. So the United States is blue. You notice that most of its allies and liberal democracies are blue. They were able to buy and sell and use any US technology that they needed. Yellow was tier 2. That's the sort of middle ground. And then we see in purple, most restrictive tier 3. And that was about the United States trying to control the export of US technology to try and slow China down. Donald Trump, president now, wants to reverse that.
Yes, he wants to, or at least in part, redraw this map, doesn't he, Stephanie, as we've seen in his discussions in Saudi Arabia about AI. So what does all of that mean in the race for AI dominance? That map that we were looking at, by the way, from the US Department of Commerce.
Yes. So it's really interesting because what we saw before was wanting to control US technology so that it couldn't be exported to China. That hasn't been working for the reasons we've just heard. They've been finding slightly shadowy ways through their supply chain to get the chips anyways. And also, they're just making such incredible progress. So now we've redefined what success looks like. And success looks like we want to limit the export rather of Chinese tech. So how do you do that? You say anyone who's using Huawei's AI chips is now violating US trade sanctions. You can't use them. So it's about stopping Chinese tech from spreading throughout the world rather than stopping US tech. It's been flipped around.
Okay.
And that tells you how powerful China is becoming as a threat in the US mind.
Okay. We're going to explore this a lot more through the programme, aren't we, Stephanie? With us to help discuss that US-China tech war, we have the highly regarded author on AI, Eva Dow, and we're also joined by Gregory Allen, who's director of the Wadhwani AI Centre at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, where he leads research into AI geopolitics and national security. Really welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Let's begin with that article from the think tank at Chatham House, which says the US is trying to get other countries to essentially make a binary choice about their AI technology, where they get it from, America or China. Does Gregory, the US and China, see this dominance in AI as essential if they are going to be the future dominant force in the economy, in the military, and so forth?
In a word, yes. For many years now, leaders in both the United States and China have viewed leadership in artificial intelligence technology as foundational to the future of economic and military power. That was true in the first Trump administration. The Biden administration doubled down on that hypothesis. And the moves that you're seeing in the second Trump administration, while not a continuation of every facet of that strategy, are certainly a continuation of that underlying logic.
Okay, and Stephanie, would you like to come in there? I'm sure you've got a question, many questions.
Yes, I was wondering if we think that the framework of US versus China is even the correct one, because Chris Miller's book, Chip War, talks about it's really the United States and allies. It's the Netherlands, it's South Korea, it's Japan, it's Taiwan, and the US, and then it's China. So do we need to reframe this and not have it be such a Cold War focus, but actually a bit more complex?
Well, the Cold War was also U.S. and allies versus the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies. And I certainly agree with you that the right way of thinking about this is the United States and its allies against China. And while in the early days of the Trump administration, there was a lot of language that was provoking to U.S. allies, more recent language coming out of Vice President J.D. Vance talks about the United States and Europe being on the same side and framing that in terms of the competition with China. And so I do think this Trump administration is very conscious of the fact that they really need allies to get on board here. One final thing I'll say on that is that that's coming with both carrots and sticks. If you look at the kinds of deals that President Trump is trying to strike across the Middle East, that's saying, here's everything that the United States has to offer you if you choose Team America. On the flip side, of course, these export controls do come with real penalties for countries that might choose China or try to split the difference and choose both sides. One example of that was announced just this week is the fact that any country that is using Huawei chips, which are made in China but made using U.S. semiconductor manufacturing equipment, are in fact subject to export controls. And that means any buyer of Huawei chips, whether that be in the Middle East or Europe or Latin America, they're putting themselves at risk of U.S. sanctions.
And Eva, just briefly on this one before we move on to the next topic. Is there not room for both China and America on this front? Why is there such a battle over this?
Yeah, and until quite recently, that was more the framework. The international supply chain was viewed as sort of one that involved both the United States and China and many countries, and it was so intertwined that the idea of decoupling it was widely dismissed as unrealistic. And so this is quite a new framework to see it as possible to even separate the US and China ecosystems. And it speaks to China getting within striking distance of the US and it being viewed as a real race now. Until a few years ago, China was viewed as too far behind in chip technology for it to be considered a race.
OK, well, let's move on to our next topic, the next story, which is that report from Bloomberg on DeepSeek. We explained what DeepSeek was. You may remember how it sort of shocked the global tech sector with its AI model, which it said it was making at a fraction of the cost of some of the well-established Western models. Now, the article says the company's sudden emergence illustrates how China's artificial intelligence industry is thriving, despite efforts by the US to curb that. So, which country, I guess, Eva, I'll start with you on this one, has the ability to develop not just the technology, but the infrastructure to develop that technology at a rate that is going to put it in pole position?
Well, the U.S. is still in the lead, and China is doing whatever it can to catch up. And so that's partly why you're seeing these restrictions, first from the Biden administration and now the Trump administration, on China's chip industry, is to try to ensure that China doesn't catch up.
Eva, one of the things that I loved about your wonderful book, House of Huawei, which I finished last week, was you really take everybody through how the United States lost the battle for 5G. And China really developed and led on that. And I'm wondering how much of this new framing of US versus China on artificial intelligence is because the United States was caught on the back foot with 5G and does not want to surrender the lead on who sets the international standards for AI.
Yes, I think what happened with 5G very much is in policymakers' minds. That was one of the moments where U.S. policymakers and officials across the West realized that China had caught up in sort of a key technology. 5G networks were being rolled out around the world, and Huawei's equipment wasn't just cheap and cheaper than Western competitors, but they had developed a lot of the patents involved, and that sort of set off the alarm bells during the first Trump administration to develop these strategies to contain Huawei that we are seeing carry out now. Now the focus has shifted to AI, which is kind of viewed as the next battlefront.
And Gregory, we've seen obviously President Trump on his tour of the Gulf states talking to Saudi Arabia, for example, about AI agreements, but the Saudis have also been talking to the Chinese about AI technology as well, haven't they? So, does that create a sort of porous situation where there might be a transfer of technology and intelligence on AI?
Yes, I think the Trump administration should be very cognizant of the risks of these kinds of deals if there are not appropriate safeguards in place. And in fact, the Trump administration has talked about the need for safeguards. So even as the Trump administration has rejected the way the AI diffusion rule, the Biden administration rule on this policy, was separating the world into 3 tiers of countries. The Trump administration has gotten rid of that, but the Trump administration has not gotten rid of the underlying logic that very large chip sales need to go to customers where we have confidence that the appropriate cybersecurity restrictions are going to be in place and the appropriate physical security restrictions are going to be in place, that these technologies are not then shipped to China physically, or that there's some kind of remote access. That part of the policy the Trump administration has stated it intends to keep going.
Now let's take a look at the shadowy business of smuggling AI chips. We can bring in our guest, Nina Zhang, now author on the subject. Nina, great to have you with us as well. So Nina, it all sounds, as I was saying a little earlier, a bit like the script from a thriller. How much smuggling of this technology, of these chips, goes on?
Well, I'm not sure I'm the expert to comment on that specifically, but I think I would say one thing about export controls, which is that they would cause short-term chaos, but really long-term it's going to accelerate China's road towards self-reliance. So I think that's one megatrend we're seeing right now, and we are seeing that export controls are having the opposite effect of what the U.S. really wants.
Why is the U.S. so worried about that company in particular? Obviously, it's a huge company. It has a lot of resources at its beck and call. But tell us more about the US concerns there.
Right. So, right now, Huawei just last month announced its new Cloud Matrix 384 supernode, which is already challenging NVIDIA's clusters. So I think that's adding new concerns to the US government that Huawei chips are really going to, help Chinese AI companies achieve this self-reliance of AI compute infrastructure. So, we're going to see the US tightening the ropes along advanced AI chips, but Huawei is making significant inroads and progress toward, matching that AI compute capabilities. And we're just going to see that trend continue in the future.
Nina, I've got a question for you, actually, in fact, for all three of our guests, which is, in the United States, a lot of the US technology companies say that regulation will hinder innovation. They push back against it. But what we're seeing here with China is that US regulation is in fact forcing Chinese companies to innovate, and even the Chinese government to innovate in how it's supporting those companies. And that's changing the rules of the game for AI. What does this mean? What can we take away for this argument about regulation and innovation? And does it mean that companies here in Europe need to stop using that as an excuse and start innovating?
Open question. One thing that we've seen is that different countries that when they're building their tech industries, it's quite often that you do see some protectionism and support for the domestic industries, whether that's through tariffs on imports or on subsidies to domestic companies. And the United States very much has had these phases through its history also, and we're sort of in a new one right now. I think the free trade era worked really well for the U.S. businesses during that period when the U.S. was so far ahead of any competitors that these kind of policies were quite favorable. And now that China is a closer competitor, we are seeing sort of a rethinking of if we need different industrial policy in the United States now.
Yeah, industrial policy. I think that's a really good point to spring on to the next subject, the next story that we're looking at, which is from The Economist. And it says that the US AI chip giant NVIDIA processors from them continue to make their way into the hands of Chinese AI developers. I think we can hopefully bring you a look at that story in a second. So the boss of NVIDIA, of course, arrived in Beijing with a message saying that, and I'm just reading the quote here, which I made a note of, that it would unswervingly serve the Chinese market. So, Nina, the Trump administration would rather they didn't. Where does that leave things?
Well, I think in my book, US-China Tech War, I briefly overviewed the long history of US tech policy toward any uprising new tech powers. They always have to take this delicate balance between commercial interest versus national security. So with the case of NVIDIA, we're seeing exactly that delicate balancing dance the US government has been doing since, the 1970s and 1980s. So I think what that leaves us is kind of, muddled through a little bit, because the US, they have to balance these two interests. And that just means, there will be loopholes. There will still be some, room and space for Chinese tech to continue to benefit somewhat from the US tech ecosystem and continue China's tech rise.
And Eva, the boss of OpenAI, Sam Altman, he sort of presented a choice of a democratic AI chip versus an authoritarian AI chip almost. But, ultimately, we know that businesses, they want choice, consumers want choice. So how difficult do you think it's going to be for governments, even governments as big and powerful as the US and China, to say, it's a binary choice. It's either our chips or the others?
Well, that, as of this week, that essentially is what the Trump administration is saying. They're saying that it's an export control violation to use Huawei AI chips anywhere. And so they are
Is that
presenting this
sustainable? Is that sustainable, though?
I think it's very interesting policy. This is a very new sort of approach for the United States government, and it depends a lot on how they enforce it, if they really mean to enforce that to the letter or not.
And I think probably to wrap up, one question would be, if we look out over the next 12 to 18 months, the Trump administration has changed policy towards China a lot. Where do you see this going in the future? Are we going to keep controlling technology, trying to control chips, or are we going to see something that's going to change the field of competition?
I think the Trump administration has made pretty clear that it is still extremely concerned about the flow of American high technology to China and the potential misuse of that technology. So even while you're seeing moves like the elimination of the Biden administration's AI diffusion rule, you're simultaneously seeing that the Trump administration's budget request includes a 50% increase in the budget for the agency tasked with enforcing export controls. And the Trump administration banned a new category of NVIDIA chips, the H20, from being exported to China. And now the Trump administration is saying that as part of all of these negotiations on tariffs and trade and everything else, one of the things that they're very interested in being a part of that negotiation is ensuring that other countries are not backfilling American companies who are not selling this technology to China. And I don't believe any of this is likely to change. One of the things that I think is most important to highlight is that the Chinese policy of eliminating its dependence on foreign technology goes back well before the United States started its current export control strategy. It goes back to China's Made in China 2025 policy, which came out in 2015. And what we've seen is that in industries where there are no export controls, such as electric vehicles or solar panels, those are actually the industries where China has raced ahead fastest, compared with semiconductors and AI, where the export controls actually have demonstrated the ability to slow China down, if not stop them altogether.
And very briefly, a final thought from you, Nina. What does this mean for the regular person, whether it's the technology they buy or the technology that they interact with in their lives? What does all this mean for them?
Well, I think for countries, first of all, they may face a choice of, choosing between U.S. AI ecosystem versus China AI ecosystem. And for the consumer, that means inconvenience. The two systems are going to be increasingly incompatible. And, you may have two sets of products and services if you are going to travel between these two countries or two ecosystems. So it's going to be confusing and troublesome and inconvenient.
OK, an interesting thought to end the programme on. I'm sure it's a discussion will continue many, many more times. That is all from AI Decoded for now, though. So thank you so much to our guests, Nina Zhang, Eva Dow, and to Gregory Miller, and of course to Stephanie Hare. And do join us again for the next edition of AI Decoded.